This video is a part of a full course called Basic Shooting, and if you enjoyed it, chances are you're going to want to watch the rest. Click on the link in the description to watch the full course. In this video, we'll discuss the basic rules of composition, covering aspect ratio, the rule of thirds, framing, balance, leading lines, and depth of field. Your frame is your canvas. Your goal is to fill it with things that are useful to your story and arrange them in a way that is pleasing to the viewer. By the end of this video, you'll have learned what makes a good shot and how to achieve one yourself. Composition is the art of arranging objects in a frame. They're actually shapes and alignments that people find pleasing, but movie composition also needs to tell a story. The arrangement of your objects and actors in a frame can add to your storytelling by emphasizing some elements and de-emphasizing others. In a big-budget Hollywood film, the director has the expert input of the director of photography. In smaller budget movies, the director often does double duty. When speaking on filmmaking, Alexander McKendrick, teacher of filmmaking at Cal Arts, says framing and editing determine the eye path of the viewer. It might not be too much to say that what a film director really directs is his audience's attention. If you're doing everything right, every frame of your movie should be able to be plucked out at random, stuck in a frame, and hung on a gallery wall. This is a tall order, and few people succeed in it without lots of time, big budgets, great editors, and patient investors. Your budget and timeline may keep you from doing this, but there are things you can do from the very beginning to make sure that your movie looks as good as it can. Pictures are pictures regardless of how many you shoot. The rules of composition are the same for video as they are for photos. However, like everything else, it's complicated. To understand the basics of composition, we need to start out with aspect ratio. Put simply, aspect ratio is the ratio of horizontal to vertical dimensions of an image. The aspect ratio of 35mm film is 3:2, which is why photo prints are 6:4 inches. The aspect ratio of most video is 16:9. A 16:9 frame means that landscapes look fantastic, but putting a single person in the frame is more challenging. For the most part, people are vertical objects, and most of your frame is going to be empty. So what do you fill the empty space with? That's composition. One other obvious thing that affects composition of a movie frame is the fact that things are moving in and sometimes moving through it, and often your camera frame itself is moving. This is why filmmakers need lots of rehearsal. Actors moving through a frame have to hit their marks at extremely predictable times, and your camera operator needs to accommodate motion through the frame and motion of the frame, all while keeping pleasing arrangement that drives the story. All that said, can you get a book about still image composition and use it as the basis of your movie composition? Well, absolutely. The rules of composition hold true for film, painting, and still images alike. That moves us on to the rule of thirds. If you leave here with one thing, it should be the rule of thirds. It's the fundamental rule of composition. Divide the screen into thirds with 4 lines. Like a tic-tac-toe game, your objects of interest should fall at the intersection of 2 of these lines. Some cinematographers are more rigid about it than others, but it's very possible to find a movie whose every shot does not deviate from this. We mentioned before that people are vertical and movie screens are horizontal. This means that to get a person in a frame, you need to either make them very small or crop them. Both of these are perfectly acceptable. Let's take a look at Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. In this close-up of Harrison Ford, Scott and his cinematographer have chosen to chop him off at the shoulders and the top of the head to put his eyes at the intersection of the top horizontal line and the right vertical line. The eyes are the important thing. Unlike in the real world, in cinematic and photographic composition, you can chop off the top of someone's head with impunity. This is not true of people's chins. Chins need to stay in the frame unless you chop off an equal portion of the top of the head. Now, we look at people's eyes. We instinctively look at what other people are looking at. We have a deep down belief that the person inside a body is accessible through the eyes. And this is universal. When your cat or your dog wants to communicate with you, they look at your eyes, and they haven't read any psychology books. When framing a shot, if the eyes are in focus, you can get away with a lot of other things not being in focus. In this shot from Raiders of the Lost Ark, Harrison Ford returns, here seen completely in silhouette with the exception of his right eye, looking weary, which along with his distinctive hat brings personality to the shot. Also notice the out of focus white areas in the left and the right. These serve to balance the frame. Balance the frame, you ask? Imagine your frame as a shadow box that you're putting items into and that sits on a fulcrum in the center. Balancing the left and right sides normally gives off a feeling of harmony, and unbalanced frame, one of tension. While going counter to the rule of thirds, sometimes completely symmetrical framing with the object of interest in the exact center can be used extremely effectively. Some directors are slaves to symmetry, and when used properly, it can be extremely powerful. One of the most arresting users of symmetry was Stanley Kubrick, who put the rule of thirds in the back seat and replaced it with an obsessive adherence to center framing and symmetry, giving us some incredibly powerful images that depict order so perfect it becomes somewhat menacing.
Here's Johnny!
Balance does not have to be symmetrical though. Objects on one side of the screen can be balanced with objects on the other side of the screen that aren't their mirror image. In this shot from Pulp Fiction, we have Bruce Willis on the left-hand side of the screen, but the frame is balanced by the license plates. We follow lines like roads. Leading lines are usually imaginary lines that go from one object to another to draw our attention from a main object of focus to a secondary one. Going back to Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, we have a perfect example of leading lines, and this time they're actually lines. The banisters lead our attention right to the people on the left side of the screen. Note also the strong use of the rule of thirds and the post in the foreground to provide balance. The camera can emphasize what's important and de-emphasize other things by using depth of field, or DOF. Depth of field is the area of a shot that's in focus. DOF can either be deep, meaning everything's in focus, like Kubrick's image from 2001, or it can be shallow, meaning few things are in focus, like both the shots of Harrison Ford from Blade Runner and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Also notice in the close-up of Ford from Blade Runner the use of the out-of-focus building in the background to balance the frame. There are lots of books on composition, but a really good way to study is to watch good movies. How are your favorite directors using depth of field? How rigorously do they adhere to the rule of thirds? How do they use centered subjects to create tension, or use leading lines to guide your eye? Pay attention to composition while you're watching movies and television. Answer what items are in the frame and why. What do they add to the story? And what are the background objects adding to the mood of the scene? In the next video, we'll move on to how to control your camera, where you'll learn the basic operation of a camera and its parts. Combine the rules of composition and how to control your camera to add even more depth in your next video or film.